I just want to reiterate, thank you guys for your time today. This is this conversation, so we're going to have a conversation about, I'm going to introduce the panelists in a minute. We're going to have a conversation about housing and affordability as it relates to this city, but also I think how it could relate to the country and potentially even the world over time. It's a huge issue. I know that you guys are in this room because you understand that. What happens when our cities grow and prices go up and a lot of people are left out trying to figure out where they're going to live? That's the conversation we want to have. And I'm just grateful that you guys are spending some time with us to do it. I'm also super grateful for these panelists and the time they would give. They're all incredibly busy. I was just talking with Aaron at the end a second ago about Tim, who's next to me, who's the planning commissioner for Atlanta. And I mean, how many meetings do you have per day? It's 60, So anyways, to get an hour of his time is a real honor. And so I'm really excited for you guys to get to know him and hear from him today. Real quick introductions of these guys. On my far end is Aaron Fortner. Aaron Fortner is an amazing friend of mine. He's an urban planner, a city planner. He's been doing that for over 20 years. He worked at City Hall early in his career and then moved into consulting, has a consulting business called Canvas Planning. Canvas Planning has done neighborhood plans for probably half the neighborhoods that you guys live in Atlanta. He just finished doing a major reimagination of Buford Highway. He's a brilliant guy that knows a lot about how you plan cities and neighborhoods. And so excited to hear from him. In the middle is Erika Brown. Erika Brown is a good friend of mine as well. She is a realtor on the southwest side of Atlanta. Erika Brown Associates is her team. In the last 2 years, they've done 25 million. Is that right? No, 15, 25.
About 30 in the last
Almost 30 in the last 2 years in Southwest Atlanta exclusively. So for those of you that know kind of what's going on in Southwest Atlanta, that's a huge number. More importantly than that, and why I wanted to hear from her this morning, obviously she has her feet on the ground, and she's, I think, really watching and understanding the grassroots things that are happening in the transitioning neighborhoods on the west side. But her family and then 4 other families moved into, they were around a school called Peace Prep Academy on the west side that's near English Avenue, and they were seeing kind of how English Avenue was kind of getting sucked up by investors and just transition and everything else, kind of like as people were speculating on what's happening next on the west side. And so these 5 families decided to actually buy a lot and build their family house to raise their family in English Avenue and to stabilize the neighborhood and to try to understand how they could be an advocate for that neighborhood as they go through transition that's necessarily going to happen. So brilliant story, going to hear about that. And then to my left is Tim Keane, who is, in my mind, maybe, I think he's probably the most talented city planning commissioner in the country. There you go. He agrees. That wasn't if you don't know who he is or if you haven't heard about him, he came to the city in 2015. Kasim Reed hired him as our planning commissioner. Before that, he was in Charleston for 11 years. If you've been to Charleston recently and seen how beautiful that city is becoming, Tim had a huge hand in that. And Tim is the one that's going to really be in charge of kind of casting vision for our government on what our zoning and our planning could look like. He, along with Ryan Gravel and some other people, developed the Atlanta City Design, which we'll talk about some, which is kind of this like idea of, okay, over the next 20 years, what do we really want this city to look like? And so I'm really honored to have all 3 of these guys here. I want to talk really quickly just about the topic and kind of really identify what this conversation is not going to be about. This is not a political conversation. I think that if you live in this city, if it's your home, and especially if you own a business or run a business in this city, this is a topic that you need to know about and be an advocate for. So it's not like, because of how you grew up or because of what you think, or if you really understand the challenges of the topic, if you really understand the problems that we're trying to solve, it's something that everyone necessarily should become an advocate for if you care about the city and you care about people in general. So it's not a political conversation. It's also not going to be necessarily about subsidized government solutions. While we recognize that those are really important, and we have some great housing authorities in the metro area, and we might touch on that subject, I want this conversation to be much more about what can it look like for all of us, especially as people in the real estate community or the development community or just the private sector in general. What does it look like for us to not only participate in the conversation, but bring solutions to the table? And so that's where I'm hoping we'll go with the conversation. So that's all of the That's all of the setting the table. I'm going to start with a quote from past Mayor Kasim Reed. He said, "Atlanta is the leading cultural and economic center of the Southeast precisely because of our legacy of inclusion." There's a history with Atlanta in the city. There's some really amazing things about it. There's also some really challenging things about it. Could each of you, from your perspective, identify the challenges that we have currently when it comes to housing and development? And then based on both our history and future opportunities for growth, what are some innovative and influential solutions that you think might happen? Let's start with Aaron down there.
Yeah, I think in general, it's not just unique to Atlanta, but we have a development system that works really well for building single-family houses and for throwing up 300-unit apartment developments, and we have those everywhere, right? That's kind of what Atlanta is a lot of very high density and a lot of single-family houses, and a lot of the country is like that, and development is sort of geared up to create those things. And I think what our opportunity is in Atlanta, nationally, but also in Atlanta, is to start to find all the other ways we can live. Because there's things in between the 400-unit apartment development and the single-family house with a big yard. There's a lot of things in between that. In Atlanta, we're starting to see townhomes, so that's sort of a more urban way of living, and now that's very familiar to us. But there's even more than that. There's even more variety, and a lot of you travel to different cities, and it's that variety that makes these other cities so amazing and so livable, and so we're going to get that in Atlanta, and you all are going to be a part of that, and part of that bringing awareness to buyers that those things are out there. So that I think is a big opportunity. I'm really excited to see that. I think in Atlanta, I've been here about 22 years, and I've been here long enough to see sort of the transition of people in Atlanta who 22 years ago felt like this was still a small town. You know, you could get from one side of Atlanta to another in 15 minutes in your car alone, and anywhere you needed to go, you could get. And you had your house, and it felt like a small town. But we're becoming a big city, and that's good. We should become a big city. But what that means is that we're not going to be like a small town anymore. And so I do a lot of this in my planning work, and I tell communities that if you still want to live in a place where you can get from one side of the city to the other in 15 minutes by driving alone in your car, you're not in the right place. You need to move. You need to go somewhere else. We would love for you to stay, but you're not going to be very happy here because we're becoming a real city. And so I think our opportunity is to own being a big city because there's tremendous advantages that come out of really being a city, a real city. And I think we're sort of not quite there, and we're in the growing pains of becoming that. And I think that's our opportunity, is to realize that potential.
So I'm coming from I grew up in Texas, so I've been in Atlanta now almost 10 years, it'll be 9 years this year. And so I just knew Atlanta growing up being like the Mecca. It was like the place to be, you know. And so I, just from an outside perspective and now living here, I guess one of the issues is that Atlanta has grown dramatically a lot and will continue to grow. So I would just like to see more of the connection between transportation and schools and planning as well, and development and community involvement, so that this can continue to be a place where we can grow and thrive and be able to get around. And if I work here, I want to be able to get to my kids' school in 15 minutes, and those types of things that, like you mentioned, we can definitely make happen.
Okay, is this working? Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Well, thinking about Atlanta's history and its future, what I would say to start with is that Atlanta in 1970, the population of Atlanta was 496,000 people in 1970. The region was 1.8 million. So today, the region's population is 6 million and the city's is 475,000. So I'm here representing the city of Atlanta, and those numbers I mean, we know Atlanta is a city in this country that is seen as phenomenal at sprawling. It's very good at that. We're good at that. And as it relates to the future, we're going to have to get good at the opposite thing, which is, as Aaron said, being a city, which involves more people. And I would argue that among the most important things for Atlanta in the future is that we have more people in the city as this region grows. The region's projected to grow by 2.5 million people over the next generation of growth, which is phenomenal change. That's the equivalent of adding Charlotte and its region to ours over that period of time. And the city needs to absorb a lot of that growth, I think. We think the city should become a city of more than 1 million people over this next generation of growth. And if you lined up every city in America and you asked them, how have you felt you've done on affordability in your city? I think 100% of them would say we're not satisfied. We've not done this well. It's a huge challenge. And Atlanta has an opportunity to do it well, and we have to do very specific things. But when it comes to affordability and the other big issue that's so discussed, which is mobility, transportation, as hard as those things are to address as a city, they are easier with more people. And so one of the things we have to do, I think, as a community is we have to embrace growth as a means to a better city, not as something that needs to be managed or mitigated, but something that has to be not accepted, something that has to be part of how we shape our city. And that's not normal for people because usually growth is associated with negative things. And that's absolutely not the case in Atlanta. And I think that's a fundamental part when you talk about affordability in the city that we have to acknowledge, and we can get more into that.
That's great. I think it's important to, and we'll talk about it in a minute, about identifying that growth can be a very exciting thing. It doesn't always have to be this negative idea of like, oh, all the rich people are taking over. I think there's innovative ways that it can become exciting, which leads me to my next question, and this is for you, Tim. So you created the Atlanta City Design. In that, Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea of the beloved community was kind of at the center of at least like the theos, like the overarching, like, hey, let's acknowledge our history and what's distinctive about Atlanta. Certainly Auburn Avenue, the Civil Rights Movement, we all know kind of, hopefully, if we don't know, you should be learning about the rich history that's distinctive to Atlanta on the planet. And that centered in this Atlanta City Design that you put forth that said, we want to embrace that history to help inform how we're going to grow in the future. So it's very clear that you believe that our city's growth should be for everyone. How does that happen?
Well, let me say a couple things about this. First of all, the Atlanta City Design, you can see it at atlcitydesign.com, or you could go to our studio website, which is atlantacitystudio.org, I think. It's on the city's webpage. The Atlanta City Design, Ryan Gravel came into our office in the fall of 2016 to produce this piece of work, and the reason for doing it was that Atlanta didn't have a plan, in my opinion. And we have lots of plans, don't get me wrong, there's many documents. But none of them were specific enough. As a matter of fact, I would argue that they tended to enable a very low-level discussion about growth, which had to do usually with zoning and land use. So they enable these small-scale conversations about land use and zoning at a neighborhood scale. They don't say, what is the city you want to become? And that's what we asked Ryan to help us with city design. We didn't ask city council to adopt it, as you do with most plans. You've heard the idea that we adopt these plans and then they sit on shelves. We didn't ask them to adopt it. They actually amended the city charter of the city, which is a much more significant action that they rarely do, to add city design, because it's not something you update, it's a design for the city. And it's a design for the city at 1.2 million people. And fundamental to it is this opportunity Atlanta has, again, like most cities don't, to include everyone. And part of it is that, Atlanta right now is a relatively affordable city if you look at cities across America. And it's a city where very poor people live in the city and all up and down the income spectrum. That's unusual. You know, in cities that are in demand, poorer people have been kicked out. You know, I mean, they can't live there anymore. We don't have that situation. We have to get very specific about how we address issues of displacement, number one, and then also how we enable a greater diversity of new people coming here to live here. On the displacement piece, here's an example on the west side of the city. We're working in Vine City, English Avenue. That area, the first issue when it comes to displacement tends to be the forcible displacement of people that have lived in the community for a long time, in some cases a generation, that own their property. As property values increase, they can't afford the additional taxes and get pushed out. That's the story around many areas that have gentrified, including in Atlanta's case, Old Fourth Ward. So we can't let that happen. So how do we address it? We have to know exactly who in this community is low income that is subject to this happening, that is vulnerable to that. So we found out, we said, okay, what if we paid their tax increases forever so they don't have to worry about that? There's many things to do, but this was just the first thing. So we found out how much it would cost to do that. And in Atlanta's case, we went and found the money to do it. So we raised the money to put in a fund at the West Side Future Fund to pay for increased taxes for this group of people, several hundred homeowners. What I'm just saying is you have to get very specific with how you do this. It isn't a conceptual thing. It's a who are these people and how do they need help kind of situation. And in Atlanta's case, we have resources to do such things. Some communities can't. In that case, what you hear from other cities is they want to create things like anti-displacement zones. When you find out what that is freezing taxes for relatively short periods of time, 5 to 10 years. And in order to freeze taxes, you have to get approval of everybody. You got to get the state of Georgia, the Atlanta Public Schools, Fulton County, the city. How do you think that's going to go? You know? So the thing was, well, we can't give up. Let's find another way we can raise money. So that's how you deal with the displacement. And then we can talk. I've talked way too long. So I'll talk maybe in a minute about what we do about housing for new people coming here.
That's great. Thank you. Next question, growth. You guys have all kind of mentioned it. I think these are the numbers that I have that are pretty close to accurate. Over the next 25 to 40 years, somewhere in there, the metro area will grow by almost 50%. So we're just under, this is a year ago, so we've surpassed 6 million now, but from 6 to over 9 million. And then Atlanta is set to absorb about 600,000 to 700,000 of those residents. So you mentioned 1.2 million. I think that's on the projections. So in the next generation, we're going to grow to almost 1.2 million people. The reality is density is coming to our city, right? That's just, it's happening. If you are not aware of that yet, like this is your warning. Density is coming to the city of Atlanta. So historically, what that means and what the narrative is more people means more development. More development means not only displacement, but also higher prices. And we all have stories of seeing that happen over the last decade. How can we, especially in this room, we've got a lot of people who, each business owner in this room probably has a community of 50 or 70 or 100 people in their sphere of influence. They're controlling kind of the narrative for the people that are moving into the city because they're helping them find homes. They're projecting their own marketing across the way that they're selling homes or developments or townhouses or whatever. How can we change that narrative? Or how can we create a new narrative that's not everything's getting developed, so there's no room for anybody else? How can we change it to, no, this is something, our growth and our density can be a good thing? And that's for anybody to answer.
Yeah, I got two things on that. One is I think what's not great is being a city that's not dense enough to really be a really fully functioning city. And we're sort of a little bit in those growing pains. And this is sort of to what Tim mentioned, that being a dense city is the best kind of a city. And we're not quite there yet, but what you get out of density is you get several things. One is you get the more of the retail and the goods and services that come close to you, that they end up being close to you, because it wants to, retail and goods and services want to be near rooftops, right? And so the more density we get, the more we get those kinds of services that really every neighborhood and every community want. And so that's a good thing that you get out of density. The other thing is that we have some ambitious transit plans in the city. Well, transit doesn't work without density. And so we really need to be a city that is more dense so that we can have the things that a real city really has, and we can enjoy those things. And I tell everybody, because it's like being a city planner, whenever I bump into anybody, it's like they want to ask me about traffic and, you know, what's happened in Atlanta. And what I tell everybody is that when as it relates to traffic, is it will not get better. So just know that. You got to know that. And I don't care what project you're hearing about and what lane they're adding on whatever highway, it will not get better. So don't have any expectation of that. You need to plan your life in Atlanta knowing that it's going to get worse, and making decisions about how you move and where you live and where you work, knowing that it's not going to get better. The second thing I'd say, and this is really just for the real estate minds in the room, that I want you all to know that there are some things happening at the city that are very helpful for accommodating more growth. One of the things is right now the city is about to approve a change to R4 zoning, which I think if you sell houses, there's a very, very good chance you're selling a house that in Atlanta that is zoned R4. And there's a change going through now that will allow R4 properties to have an accessory dwelling in the back of the house. And I'm just telling you all that because a lot of y'all may not know that. And I think that's really helpful. And if you know that and you're telling buyers that, then that's how we're going to get the word out that, oh, there's another way to, one, provide an income stream for a property owner, but it's another way to provide a smaller unit of housing in the neighborhoods of our city that is going to be how we accommodate more affordable ways of living in the city. And what I'm really excited about is when you all are working with properties that are zoned R4 or even R5 as a zoning district that would allow accessory dwellings, that if you have a property that's not yet built, the easiest way to get an accessory dwelling is to build it all into the development of the house and rolling it all into the financing of the construction of the house. It's much more difficult to buy a home and then add the accessory dwelling after the house is already there. So I just think you all could be a part of providing that kind of urban way of living, more affordable way of living, just by knowing that. And there's also a missing middle zoning district that is also getting created. Will I talk about that a little bit?
I'm about to ask you about it.
Okay.
Let's real quick, let them answer that question, then we'll come back to missing middle.
Well, I was just going to say, especially as real estate agents, it's important for us to help. It's because we know Atlanta is going towards density, whether we like it or not. It's helpful to prepare our clients to help them to see the perspective of that. So what he's saying is what we've lived. We've had our previous home. We had a basement, so we always rented it out to someone. We've had probably about 10 roommates throughout various seasons of life. People that we probably wouldn't normally just meet and be friends with on the street, that we've developed lifelong friendships. Whenever I decided to start my company and leave my former career, there was a time where I didn't even have to drive. Like, my kid went to school here, so I can walk and drop them off here. There was a corner grocery store that I could just go and pick up some rice. My cousin lived around the corner, so we carpooled and tag team. I mean, that's what communities are about. So it's going to be really beautiful for us as agents to help prepare our clients and to help show them that perspective of what life could be like and what it could look like as we're moving towards this density in our city.
Well, I guess the only thing I'd add is we tend to get, people think of density as negative typically, I think, because of traffic or those kinds of things. And totally agree with Aaron that's a good message for people. Some additional ammunition. Typically when cities around the world are ranked in terms of traffic congestion, Atlanta falls in the top 10. Congratulations. Usually we're between 7 and 9, somewhere in there. And usually somehow we're flanked by Paris and London. So, after telling people that
the only list that we get flanked by Paris.
After usually telling people that traffic will only get worse, I say this is good news, because think of this, if we can just get people focused on not reducing traffic, but remaking our streets for people, we could have so much satisfaction as a city, because our streets are terrible. I mean, they are very difficult to walk. I mean, if you walk to a MARTA station, you even just walking to a MARTA station, in some places you take your life in your own hands, and there's very few people there. So think of all the innovation and things we could do with our streets to make them more for people. We can have such satisfaction as a community around that issue. We'll have the best next 30, 40 years if we can focus on that. If we keep talking about traffic, we'll be frustrated forever and get nowhere. Because what we do is we believe somehow that we can help the car go through 5 seconds quicker, so we're focused on that, and we've missed this chance that the city has to make a place here. And that's, if you're moving here or you're moving around in the city, it's such a more satisfying perspective. I mean, to be about remaking this place towards people versus worrying about traffic, which you can do nothing about.
That's brilliant. I love that idea of stop worrying about reducing traffic, start worrying about remaking our streets for people in particular. It's brilliant. Missing middle, you mentioned that. So there's this concept, it's fairly new, a couple of decades or something, that's called the missing middle. And in this conversation, a lot of times we think about a few certain people groups, certainly people that are living at or below the poverty line, right, is a concern. And then I think people who have been in our communities for decades or generations, who were maybe blue collar, lower middle class, or middle class, but now are facing this kind of problem of displacement. Those people always are a part of this conversation. People that sometimes are not historically a part of this conversation are service providers, people that work in the retail industry or in restaurants, policemen, firemen, teachers, all of the people that staff our schools and our city services and our restaurants and our retail that are making, right at the poverty line to $100,000 a year, they get left out, right? As cities grow, they get left out. And so what's happening now, and you guys all know it, you've seen it and you feel it, in this city right now over the past decade, there's two types of development. There's single family infill development, which primarily goes to people who are at the upper 2 to 3% of the income bracket, right? And the reason that that's the only kind of real developments happen in infill is because that's the only thing that's really allowed to be built and works economically for the developer. Then the other thing you see is 4-story apartment buildings. There's very little in between that, right? So we have stuff for the upper 5% family homes, and then we have apartments for anybody else that wants to rent an apartment. We're starting to see some townhomes and stuff that's a little bit in there, but everybody in that $30,000 to $100,000 a year income bracket has a real struggle to find somewhere to live, whether they want to rent or buy. So can you talk about that, help expand on the missing middle idea, and then what do we do for those folks?
Yeah, so this is a brand new idea based on something we did 100 years ago, which is basically everything you need to know about good city planning. Is we have new ideas, and they're all based on how we did things when there weren't cars. So we really don't have any new ideas, which is kind of great. So missing middle is getting back to this thing. If you are familiar with some of our neighborhoods, historic neighborhoods in Atlanta that were built around trolleys, we had things like 4-plexes and 8-plexes and 12-plexes. And that is a kind of housing that planners nationally are starting to call missing middle housing. It's sort of what it refers to what Jonathan just described, that it's in the middle of that spectrum of there's the single family home and then there's apartment buildings, and you can even lump sort of high density condo buildings in there, and then but there's something in the middle. And that's our opportunity in Atlanta, and other cities are doing this too, is getting a handle on how to create that. So the city has done its work and has created a zoning district that's going to be available for property owners and for neighborhoods who are interested in it to begin to pursue, that is going to facilitate creating developments that are up to 12 units. And there's something really just inherently smart about this kind of housing that helps to create more affordable housing. One is they're very small scale. So what that means is there's a lot of cost that this kind of housing doesn't need to bear. It doesn't need to, at some point when you do multifamily, when you have, there's sort of a tipping point that you have enough units in the building that you need to have all the amenities. You need to have the club room, and you need to have the gym, and you need to have the pool. And if there's enough people in this thing, and depending on the site that you're on in the city of Atlanta, you probably might need a parking deck. So all of those things lead to cost, and let alone more density you get, it could lead to a different construction type. That all of that leads to a cost that gets passed on to the renter. While this kind of housing, 12 units or less, really between 4 and 12 units, is very, very, it's about as cheap as you can build multifamily housing. It's wood frame construction. There's no parking deck. There's no club room. There's no gym. There's no pool. So those costs don't get wrapped into the development. And it can be it's a way to make the development as affordable as possible. Another thing that's really great about it is that we're getting to the point where we're starting to feel like, real density in Atlanta, there's still this sense that we want to protect our neighborhoods, and that the high density of Atlanta should be in Midtown, and it should be in downtown, it should be in Buckhead, and in parts of the Beltline. Well, the great thing about missing middle housing is for a lot of missing middle housing, it doesn't really look or feel or operate much different than what houses do in a neighborhood. So there's this sort of a much more openness in some of our neighborhoods in Atlanta to missing middle housing being a form of density that will come into proximity with the neighborhood or be embedded into the middle of the neighborhood, because it can be 2 or 3 floors. It can be about the same size as a very large house in a neighborhood. It doesn't have a parking deck. You can park behind it. You can park on the street. So it's a very nimble type of housing that is really much more comfortable fitting in on the edges or in the middle of a neighborhood. So that's now available. Well, it will be, hopefully in a couple weeks, be adopted and be available. And I'm hopeful that the real estate community will start to look at sites and in neighborhoods or on the edges of neighborhoods and start to realize that, we can start providing this form of housing, a new way of living based on an old way of living, that is a new opportunity for urban living in Atlanta.
I think it's important to note, as you're starting to identify these ideas and then have these conversations with other people, if you live in one of the neighborhoods that was platted and developed in the 20s or 30s in Atlanta, you probably already have these types of buildings in your neighborhood. I live on Howard Street in Kirkwood. I have 2 that I can see from my front porch. Virginia Highlands, they're all over the place. So anyways, it's like he said, this is not a new idea. It's
just one other thing about that, Jonathan. So these amendments will go to City Council on January 22nd, so they should be law on the 22nd. If you want to know more about these, because there's other things too, you go to the City of Atlanta webpage, Department of City Planning. On the left column, there's an item called zoning reform, and it goes through all those things. And you can always go there to see what kind of zoning amendments that we're proposing. What will happen on the 22nd as well is that all of these existing small apartment buildings, like the ones you mentioned, will be made legal. I
have an amazing story about that.
When the neighborhoods of Atlanta were made single family, all these small apartment buildings, and there's 10,000 units in the city like this, where a lot of service workers work, they were made illegal, which means you can't invest in them because the expectation is they'll be gone at some point. So they'll be made legal on January 22nd, saving 10,000 units in the city.
That's amazing.
I want to add one thing to the tail end of that. The other thing that these illegal buildings that have had missing middle, and because they've been non-conforming, if the building goes vacant for more than 12 months, you're not allowed to put the units back. And there are several, I don't know what the quantity of those examples are, but there are those out there. This change is going to make it legal to take old buildings that were missing middle, maybe if they've been vacant for more than a year, now you will be able to put units back in. So that's something to be looking for.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity.
Quick practical story. So one of the buildings I mentioned across the street from my house on Howard Street, it's a 12-unit U-shaped building. Maybe it's 8 units. And I met the owner. He's owned the building for 20 years, and he was saying that for the past 7 years, he just wants to put a central laundry for the 8 units in. He's been trying to do it for 6 years, and he couldn't get the permit, right? Because there was no way for him to put a laundry into his building. And he has one tenant that's been in that building for 25 years, right? And it's just a major, I think that it's a huge change. And
one other zoning related thing, there's also some parking amendments that you'll see there. One of them is that we'll no longer require off-street parking for buildings that were built before 1965, which has caused problems for people reoccupying old buildings. The reason for 1965 is that's the year the city started requiring off-street parking of people. So we're assuming if you build a building before then you weren't required to provide parking, and so you shouldn't require it anymore. We're also reducing parking requirements for a lot of other residential uses and actually adding some parking maximums in proximity to MARTA stations.
it's amazing. Okay. We could talk about that literally for the rest of the day. I want to value y'all's time. Let's talk about equity for a quick, hot minute. In the Atlanta design, equity is a core value. There's 5 core values, and I love when I reread it the other night. So he mentioned where you can find the Atlanta City design. We've got some pamphlets in the back. Grab one when you leave. Everyone in this room needs to be familiar with the Atlanta City design. As you have this conversation, as you start to value these ideas, it's a really, really strong resource to understand where the city is trying to take us in the context of the conversation. So in the city design, there's 5 core values. Equity is a core value, but equity also kind of permeates the other 4 values, right? So it defines it as, the Atlanta City design defines equity as the continuous, contentious, and often unappreciated work of ensuring that all the benefits of nature, access, ambition, and progress, which are the other core values, accrue to everyone. So I want to ask this question of you, Tim. Why should we care about this? May seem like an obvious answer, but why should we care about this? And then how does that happen as the Atlanta City design hopefully comes into focus?
Well, I mean, first of all, the Atlanta City design came out of a very public process that Ryan and the city planning department, studio, mainly staff, and so there was a lot of conversations about what makes Atlanta what Atlanta is. And so this issue of people at all income levels and all types of people can live in the city, and that's what makes the city so special. So equity is the number 1 core value, and as you said, Jonathan, is found throughout the document, because if we lose that, then we've lost what Atlanta is as a city. And then it gets into a lot of specifics around what are the things we need to do to ensure this is so. And so this conversation is fundamental to everything we're doing. So whether it's the zoning ordinance and these amendments that Aaron just outlined, or it's the urban ecology work we're doing around nature in the city, equity is central to that conversation. How are we going to help people that can't navigate these things on their own? How do we ensure that they're part of this too? So there isn't a conversation, or the historic preservation strategy that we're doing right now. The city hasn't done one since the 1980s, or the transportation plan that we did. So this equity component is fundamental. And so the solution in every case is different, depending on what it is. But I mentioned the one about displacement. We're talking a lot about new housing in the city, and housing's only one component of it. But the thing that we're confronting as it relates to housing from an equity standpoint is that we want some diversity of people throughout the city. It should be geographic equity, among other things, and that's hard for people to confront. How do we address the geographic inequity in the city, and getting very specific with people and how we do that, because it's hard.
Yeah.
Because what you're saying to people is your neighborhood has to change, or your area. If you really care about this issue, then the city has to change, and that doesn't mean other parts of the city. That means you're part of the city too, and getting specific about that. And so that's the challenge and why it's presented the way it is, because this is the responsibility of every resident of the city.
Yeah.
It's not just the city, or it's not just that part of the city, it's every person.
That's where the contentious piece comes in, but it's important, I think, to note, like, just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not worth doing. Yeah. I think because equity is so central to all these conversations, I want to give you guys both just a minute if you have any further thoughts on why equity is important to you personally or to this conversation.
It's important to me personally because I'm confronted with it every day, the injustice that I see in my neighborhood in regards to equity when I'm on my side of town versus when I'm in other parts of the city, in various aspects: housing, schools, transportation, streets, etc. So I mean, yeah, and I don't want Atlanta to, become, when it does become a big city, to become like a San Francisco or like, places where it's just the same thing everywhere you go. Atlanta is a front runner in culture for the entire world. So, part of that culture is diversity. In order for us to stay diverse, we need equity. So it's very important.
Yeah, and from a planning perspective, I just always think that the most diverse communities are the best communities in every sense of the word. More diversity in mobility options, more diversity in goods and services, more diversity in ways you can live. But in terms of housing diversity, I think that there's so many different kinds of people that we should hope live in the community. From the teacher at the school to the bartender at the pub, and to your child who graduates and comes back from college, to the elderly, to you as you move up and down your own, go through cycles of life and move through stages of life. And what was so interesting for me is I've kind of thought for a long time now that, this is something that do-gooders and city planners kind of are advocating for. And this past year, we did a master plan for the Morningside Lenox Park neighborhood, which is one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city. And we asked them sort of open-ended at the beginning of the process, what are the major problems we need to solve in your neighborhood? And one of the number one responses that the neighborhood communicated back to us was affordability, which I thought was so great. They are thinking about affordability. They're thinking about it from a very personal perspective. This is not some agenda. This is not some feel-good, let's be do-gooders. We're on some crusade together. No, they're thinking, I live here. I'm thinking about the next 10 years of living here, and I value affordability, and I want to see more ways for all these examples that I just gave. My son, or my mother, or me when we're going to downsize. So I think we're all starting to understand why it would be valuable to have other ways of living and more affordable options for living.
One real quick story. I tell this story all the time. If you know me very well, you've probably heard me tell it before. But I was on a panel like this 3 years ago with Ryan Gravel, who created the Beltline, who also helped form the Atlanta City Design. And the question was asked, what are you most excited about in Atlanta's growth? And his answer was, I'm really excited about Atlanta's potential because if you look at the other top 10 cities in this country, all of them already became who they are. All of them already established their identity, and they established it in a different period in history. So the New Yorks, the Chicagos, the LAs, the San Franciscos, they became who they are as a city pre-civil rights, a lot of them pre-women rights, a lot of them pre-World War I and World War II. It was a different time, it was a different place in history. And he was like, here Atlanta is, this kind of like gangly teenager that's coming along in 2018, and we're going to figure out, we're going to establish who we are in a different time. In addition to that, we have this distinctive history because of being the Mecca, because of the University Center, because of Auburn Avenue. We have this distinct kind of history that could propel us into something that is unique and has not been done before when you talk about cities becoming. And so I think that's the part that I get so excited about, is it's not just about us making a better way of life for us and for the people in Atlanta. It's about us potentially setting a model in motion that could teach other cities all over the planet how to become better cities.
I want to just add one thing to that. Tim mentioned that we're basically just now back at our peak population from 1970. In 1970, we were, almost 500,000, and we just now got back to that. And I think what's so interesting for us all to be thinking about is, this blows my mind, that we are now back at peak population, but we all know the density that's been added to the city. So think about that. We know where all the new housing is. What that means is there's a lot of parts of our city where people are not living as densely as they used to live. And that's really about I-20 South. And so the opportunity for the next 20 years is to make those the places where they're back. But we do it in the right way. We don't wipe them out. We don't move everybody out. We do it in the right way. But I think you all can be a part of that cultural shift for us as a city in the next 20 years of thinking about how south of 20 becomes the future neighborhoods of our city.
Yeah, and the ROI there I think is huge on if we could do it the right way, if we could innovate, if we could come up with new ideas, if we could let equity be our lens with which we grow through. Erika, one question for you real quick. I want you to talk about English Avenue. You guys move into the neighborhood. Most of you guys, I think it's like this is our family home, right? Like we're going to raise our kids here. We're going to invest deeply into this neighborhood. Can you talk about, A, what led you guys to that decision, and then B, what have some of the challenges been in the first year and a half that you've been there?
Well, we feel like God has called us to move there, one. And my husband works at a school, has been there for, I think this is 4th year, called Peace Prep. And through him working there and lots of my friends just volunteering, we just developed a deep heart for the community and the school. So we decided to, sell our homes and move there. So we have a few challenges that have basically been like trickle effects throughout our journey. I think it's like a year and a half we've been on this journey to move into the neighborhood. English Avenue specifically is 96% investor owned, so it's very unique in that the majority of the people that own in the neighborhood don't live in the neighborhood. So because of that, you have, and they bought really cheap, like it went like $2,000, like lots of properties. So when you have those two dynamics, that really can cause a lot of like problems. So you have some people who are just waiting for a big cash out. So they have really unrealistic expectations in how much their property is worth. Also, a big problem in the neighborhood is like blighted properties. So because right now there's no teeth around the vacant property issue, you have these properties that are just sitting and just sitting and just sitting. So we look at it like, okay, so most of us are families of 5 and up, and we're like, okay, these houses were built, 1920s. They're 1,200 square feet on a 3,000 square foot lot, and they've been vacant for 20 years. We've renovated houses before, and we know that, okay, it's gonna probably cost more to renovate than it will to build. So then we say, okay, let's build a house. So then we're in the missing middle situation where when you go to acquire a lot and you wanna build, there's a gap, right? Between what the value is and what that whole total cost is. So we go to the city and say, hey, Invest Atlanta, we have a teacher, a great example, we have a teacher who, she did not sell a property. They did not sell a property. This is their first time owning a home, and we have a $20,000, $30,000 gap. Can you help us with down payment assistance? The problem with down payment assistance is it has to be an existing structure. So the only incentives that the city has currently for homeowners, for new construction, will be towards builders. But a builder is not going to necessarily want to build in English Avenue because there is not enough comps to support a new construction in English Avenue. So you see like the trickle effect with a lot of the issues that we've had. But we're excited. We have all acquired lots finally. and we're moving and we're building in there, and yeah, so.
I love Erika for so many reasons, not just her story, but I think it's an amazing, I wanted to have her today, A, because she's an amazing realtor and has an amazing perspective on this conversation, but B, because of her story, because like when we start to talk about what are we supposed to be doing, besides being in this room and having this conversation, what are we supposed to be doing? Some of you might need to move. Like that might be something that you need to consider doing. And then some of us, it might just be literally having this conversation again, over and over again. It's everything, it's as crazy and sacrificial as thinking about, man, should I move my family? And it can be as simple as, I just need to go read the Atlanta City Design and start to think about, what do I think about it? So it's amazing. I want to give you guys an opportunity to ask a few questions. I also want to value your time. We started a little bit late. I hope everybody can stick around maybe 10 more minutes. Real quick before you do that, we'll talk about resources that you guys love around this topic in a minute, but one of my favorite is a book called Walkable City by a guy named Jeff Speck, who's kind of a brilliant planner and urbanist and stuff. And he says that 2 of the remedies for affordability, some of the low-hanging fruit is ADUs, which you mentioned earlier, and then inclusionary zoning. Tim, can you just share your thoughts on that, like agree, disagree? And then, I mean, we know that ADUs are kind of coming, but what does some of that look like for us?
Well, the ADUs we've permitted in R5 districts for some time now. We had proposed to add them to all the single-family districts, but we're just getting to R4 next. And it's a good technique. It's as simple as, if you have the right to build a big structure on a property, you're going to do that probably if you're a builder. In this case, it kind of creates an incentive to build a smaller unit and all that. So we need to keep doing those kinds of things. IZ, inclusionary zoning, is something cities have had since the early 2000s. I know Chicago started in 2003. And it requires that a percentage of the units within a development be for low and moderate income people. We have IZ in Atlanta now. It started 1 year ago. We're requiring lower income housing for apartments on the Beltline. So ours is restricted to the Beltline overlay so far. There was discussion of whether to expand that to the whole city. We're just 1 year in, and there's different opinions about how that's affected development on the Beltline and those kinds of things, which we can talk about. But it's an important technique. It's not, the thing about all these things is that they don't in themselves solve the problem. Right. We need to do everything, so it's IZ and it's ADUs and it's missing middle and it's, a dozen things we haven't thought of yet. It's code innovation, many other things.
Good. You said something earlier about being specific, and I just keep thinking of like the metaphor for this. It's like this is surgery that we're trying to attempt. It's not like giving somebody a pill. It's like there's all of these specifics that we need to be aware of and educated on, and be sharing with our spheres of influence to help people understand that. I have a neighbor who hates the idea of ADUs. Right? It's kind of a popular thing in these established neighborhoods if you've been around. And her reason is she doesn't want a ton of cars parked on the street. And it's like we're past that. Like, the cars are going to be on the street, so let's talk about like what the real benefits of it could be, So anyways, okay, questions from you guys. Does anybody have questions? We'll take about 4 or 5 of them. Yes, ma'am, up front, Jenny Eagle. Speak loud, and I'll repeat your question. Yeah.
I think one of the biggest things that I see is this is a room of people that control a lot of conversation. I think social media, particularly neighborhood websites, and I live in Kirkwood, and it's probably one of the, I don't know if it's one of the worst, but the minute you start talking about development, you are going to have 75 people that have their opinion. No more cars, no more traffic, no more this, no more that. Right, I know that. Very close. But, and quite honestly, I haven't got enough education on it yet to be able to stick my neck out there to say this is how the conversation needs to change. But it's a huge area that these things are going on. That's number one. Number two is tax deeds and those sales, and how do we change things in that area when we're talking about displacement. So.
Where's the question there? Sorry. So how do we control neighborhood conversations? Is that a question? Or how do we participate?
How do we participate in them on social media particularly?
Okay. Yep.
Tax deed sales, amnesty with tax deeds. I see a lot of displacement occurring because the tax deed has been sold to particular large companies that are then reselling.
So how do we get involved with the section of displacement that has to do with tax deeds, and just really miseducation or naivety, I would say, in understanding who you are as a property owner?
I think it's important to we talk about. And it's simple, but it's just like being a community. So like on the west side, we have what we call senior teas once a month. And so we have access to our seniors in the community, and we invite them in, and we have different people who come and talk about, here's what's going on right now. Here's this tax deed issue. Here's this. Here are these exemptions you can take advantage of. I mean, sometimes it really is having to talk to your neighbor, have a conversation with them, and find out what they need. And yes, it's not always an immediate monetary transaction involved in it, but it's just being a good neighbor, you know? And having, if we all in this room have a lot of those conversations within our sphere of influence, it could really make a big difference. Because the resources are out there, and a lot of times those situations happen because people are unaware.
I end up getting that kind of question a lot. And so one of the things that I do in response to that is it's helpful sometimes to almost sort of use the city as not the bad guy, but to say, you know, that there is already support for what this development is proposing to do. It's either, you know, there's plans in place that support this, and in some cases, the development is just in the rights of what the zoning on their property allows them to do. You know, they don't even need permission to do any of it. So what I try to do is shift that conversation to, okay, the development's going to happen. How can we make it as good as it can be? This isn't an issue of, like, we don't want it, or I'm trying to stop it, because it's typically going to be something that can't be stopped. But to move past that to the specifics of, well, what is it that we're concerned about? And it might be that some of these, the work that Tim's doing and the planning department's been doing, we may already have some great solutions to the problems that we think may come. But let's just get more specific and talk about how can this thing be as good as possible for us in the community. Sometimes there are proposals that are way out of whack, and you should try to stop them. But most of what comes through our neighborhoods are really in line with where the city's going, and it's not helpful to just say, I don't want it. Let's talk more specific about how can this be great for our neighborhood.
I'll add one thing to that and talk about what our team is doing, which is right now for us, we feel like we can have the most impact by being the most educated we could possibly be about. So, and then flipping that education to our sphere of influence. So I'm not even prepared yet, I think I will be eventually, to go to the K&O and be like, this is why you guys need to care. I think for me, it's more like, I just want to make sure that we understand it and that we know it, that we're well-versed and comfortable carrying the torch of the narrative, if you will. Right, I think that's the first step. Like, don't get on Facebook today and go tell people that we need ADUs. Like, that's not a good first step. So, next question. Yes.
So are there any incentives or ways for small investors? Because what happens, like I live in East Lake, anything that happens, there's a huge developer they've gone all the way down Memorial, but there's no space for someone that really lives in the community and cares about that community to build anything, because it gets grabbed up. So has the city worked on any types of incentives for people that live in the community to help grow the community?
Well, I mean, there's Erika talked about the limitations of some of them, including investments and single family that require an existing structure. Most of the incentives the city has are through Invest Atlanta, which has a housing and economic development aspect to it, and that decision was made years ago. And I think you're right that their incentives tilt towards larger scale things, but they do have programs that are for owner-occupied houses to do renovation.
I think commercial, because that's a part of the issue as well. Like, just can I put a coffee shop here? Give me some incentive to grow in my neighborhood.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I do think, though, especially if you're talking commercial, Invest Atlanta is a good place to start, just to get familiar with them and understand what they do and do have available for that. Yes, sir. Mr. Logan in the back there. want to clarify. Would you like to know about cities and counties in the metro area? Because you mentioned Tucker and Decatur. Yeah. Okay, that's good. Aaron, you want to speak to that some?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's happening nationally and in Metro Atlanta is the suburbs are turning into cities, and that's really the trend of the next 20 years. Not every major city of the country, and Atlanta as an example, not everyone's going to move into Atlanta. Some won't be able to, some won't want to. But what will happen is the suburbs are going to turn into cities, and the ones that don't are going to really fall behind. And so because of that, these cities that are outside of the major city of the region, they are embracing all of these things in their own way. It sort of plays out a little bit differently with each jurisdiction. But in their own ways, they really are moving towards these same concepts. Higher density around commercial and employment centers, mixed use development, allowing permitting, changing their zoning to allow it, embracing things like townhomes and accessory dwellings. So that's now happening in many, many cities or small towns. The one thing that is still sort of playing out that makes it either happen or not happen are just market dynamics. There's some smaller areas that the market isn't quite ready in that area to make some of this happen because there's still plenty of land and you can still build single family houses. And a lot of the small towns haven't changed their strategy to try to make the urban development happen. They're sort of allowing it to happen, but it's a little bit uneven in how it's playing out right now. I don't know, Tim, if you're seeing other things as well.
All right, well, maybe one final question. I know that these guys need to go. Yes, ma'am.
I live in Midtown. I have for more than 20 years, and I've been in real estate about that same amount of time. And when the conversation of inclusionary zoning came up, a lot of the old guard, people who've been there since the 70s and 80s, were very much against it because there's mistrust at the city level and there's mistrust at the developers and tearing down a lot of old historic property. So everything I'm saying, like, I've always been a big proponent of, and I kind of use my words carefully because I don't want to be like, oh, I'm a real estate person and I've got something to get for it. But how do we take that conversation and help educate some of these people that change isn't going to be so bad? What could be some good talking points for us that there really is some change and it's not just going to be greedy developers building, multi-million-dollar homes everywhere?
The talking points would be for who? Who's the audience for those talking points? Who's the audience?
I think the people who are pushing back against inclusionary zoning or any sort of density
Okay, I
growth.
thought you meant developers. Okay, so people in the community. You know, I don't know that I have anything brilliant to say there. That's you know, it's distrust of the city. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it would be to point to the fact that we've got diversity in most places, including Midtown already. So it's just more of that. Because really the inclusionary zoning too is directed for workforce housing. So it's people that have jobs. Inclusionary zoning is not a technique that helps for very low income people. It's really for people that do have jobs. And really we need much more of that housing in the city. People that are working at restaurants and service jobs and people that work at the city or teachers and things. So that's a need that we have, and that's certainly part of the talking point. But the other thing is that you wouldn't know that they have inclusionary zoning. It's not like they put signs on the doors to say IZ unit. It's just part of the project. That's one of the things that's important about it. So over the next now 12 months, we'll see these apartment buildings getting built, and no one will know that there's any, units in there that are any different than any other.
And I would just add, in terms of accessory dwellings and then the missing middle housing, in the last 12 months, we went all over the city. I'm working with Tim to sell these changes to the zoning code and had community meetings. And for me, I find what would often help is that we would be able to say, look, in terms of accessory dwellings and missing middle housing, We're just trying to reestablish what is a historic building form in the city of Atlanta. This isn't like a brand new idea. We didn't just sort of invent this and let's just see how it goes. We used to do this. We used to allow this, and you probably live near one that was built 80 years ago when it was allowed, and it's fine. So like we're really just trying to get back to what we were doing. No one can remember like why did we stop doing it? No one knows. Like and so you can see it. It's a living thing. You probably live near it already. And then the other thing I would usually add is just the steps we're taking right now in the city to allow those things. Just allowing it isn't going to make it happen. So it's still going to be a slow go, I think, in terms of realizing new accessory dwellings in your neighborhood and realizing new missing middle in the city of Atlanta. It's still, people are gonna have to figure out how to finance it and buy the properties to do it, and it's not gonna be widespread. Hopefully at some point it builds that momentum, but we're not gonna be there in the next year or two. So we're all going to get to see in a sort of a slow pace. We're gonna get to see how it looks to build the new ones. And if there's major problems, we'll talk about it. We'll make adjustments. But right now, we don't really need to be afraid of any of it because it's not going to pop up everywhere just because we allow it.
Do you have anything to say, Eric? Okay, one last thing. 1 or 2 resources, books, articles, websites that you would recommend everyone should be reading and checking into about this.
I want to go first before Tim says this. I only have one. Get Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of the Great American City.
100%.
That's the best resource. It was written 50 years ago, but she was a prophet, and she describes the best way that cities work, and she was brilliant. And you read that, and you'll know everything. You don't need to go to grad school for city planning like I did and waste my money. You just read that book, and you're good.
Erika?
3 things. If you have any clients building new construction, encourage them to do some type of apartment or basement or something like that that can house additional people. And for you guys who are working with investors who are looking into buying and holding, please educate them on how that affects the neighborhood to buy a property and have no intention of renovating it or renting it. That's really, really important. And then How to Kill a City is a really good book if you aren't, if this is all new to you. It's really good. It's a case study in it of 4 major cities and how those cities evolve differently. That's another great resource.
Great.
I'll just add a book called Street Fight, which is on the transportation side of things, but written by the former director of the New York City Department of Transportation during the Bloomberg administration when they went in and closed a part of Times Square and made all these changes to the streets in New York. It's a great book about
Awesome.
that.
I'll add one more because I'm running this panel. If you want to dive a bit deeper, especially into the injustice side and kind of like a lot of how we got to some of that stuff, The Color of Law is a really, really great book as well. This right here is the Atlanta City Design. It's called the Passport Booklet. It's basically just an overview. It's really beautiful, some pictures and kind of overview guide. Tim's office was kind enough to bring some, and they're in the back on the table. I don't think we have enough for everybody, but just take them until they run out. And then it'll also take you to where you can find out the Atlanta City Design. They also gave us these 2 amazing, they did this incredible kind of vintage map, but it helps. It's kind of a pictorial explanation of the 5 core values. I've got 2 notebooks. I'm going to give them away to who had a birthday already this year? Anybody? All right, whose birthday is in January? There we go. Alan Corey, you get one. And then the youngest person in the room. Anybody younger than 22? 25? 28? 26? How old are you? Wait, who's back there? How old? 25? All right, you get the other one. They're up here. Thank you guys so much for being here. Give it up for these panelists. We'll be having this conversation more throughout the year. If you want to follow J.Rich Atlanta on our Instagram, we'll have a lot more information. You guys have a great day. Thank you.